Behind the closed door, Harry did not begin with accusations. He spoke of family, lost years, and children growing up far from the traditions that once shaped his own life. Then he revealed the condition Meghan believed would prove whether the palace truly wanted reconciliation or only wanted their silence. The meeting began without witnesses. Charles had refused aides, note-takers, and communications officials, leaving father and son alone with years of resentment neither could easily name. Harry tried to remain measured. He did not raise his voice or begin with old grievances. Instead, he spoke about distance, missed occasions, and the painful reality that his children were growing up separated from a family history that was still part of them. Then, he explained why he had come. Harry said he and Meghan were prepared to return for a major royal commemoration, but they would not walk back into the same uncertainty that had surrounded them before. They needed guarantees, not vague kindness behind closed doors, but clear protection from humiliation, last-minute changes, and the quiet demotion that could be disguised as protocol. The first condition concerned Meghan's place. She could not be invited as Harry's wife and then positioned like an inconvenient outsider. Harry wanted a formal role established in advance, one that could not be altered when pressure rose inside the palace. The second condition involved their children. Harry demanded direct assurance that their royal connection would be acknowledged during the visit. He would not accept them being quietly erased to protect the comfort of senior figures who still questioned where the Sussex family belonged. But the third request changed everything. Harry asked for temporary access to a royal jewel associated with Diana. Meghan believed wearing it would represent healing, continuity, and her place within Harry's family story. To Harry, it was not simply an object locked behind palace rules. It was proof that his mother's emotional legacy had not been completely absorbed by the institution that had once left her isolated. At the mention of Diana, Charles became cautious. He understood immediately that the jewel carried far more power than its material value. One appearance could reopen old pain, reshape public loyalties, and turn a ceremony of reconciliation into a battle over memory and inheritance. Harry insisted the arrangement would remain secret until the event. No advance briefing. No weeks of hostile speculation. Meghan would appear wearing the piece, and the message would speak for itself. Then Charles asked the question Harry had feared. Was this truly his request or Meghan's? The words struck deeper than an open refusal. Harry heard the old accusation beneath them, that he was no longer trusted to think, decide, or speak without someone else directing him. He warned Charles that rejecting the conditions would confirm Meghan's darkest belief. The family wanted Harry back, but only if he returned without her influence, without her voice, and without the power to demand anything on equal terms. But Charles was no longer listening only as a father, because the jewel Harry had named was protected by an unspoken rule, one that even a king could not break without setting the palace against itself. The object Harry requested had not been forgotten, misplaced, or locked away without purpose. It carried a private history known to only a few inside the royal household, and according to the rules surrounding it, no woman could wear it simply because emotion, marriage, or public sympathy demanded it. The jewel had once been closely connected to Diana, but after her death, its meaning had been divided. Emotionally, Harry believed it remained part of his mother's story. Institutionally, however, it had been placed under strict royal control. That difference mattered. It meant memory could belong to a son, while the object itself belonged to the crown. To Harry, that distinction felt cruel. He believed anything so strongly associated with Diana should not be controlled only by officials who decided when her image was useful and when her pain was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. In his mind, The palace had spent years protecting its own version of her history. Allowing Meghan to wear the piece would challenge that control. But Charles knew the hidden rules surrounding such objects. A jewel linked to a former royal woman could not simply be released because a family member requested it. Approval would have to come from the monarch, the custodians of the royal collection, and the household of the future king. That final requirement made William impossible to avoid. Even if Charles wanted to help Harry, approving the request without William's knowledge could be seen as undermining the authority he was already expected to carry. And William had his own concerns. He had quietly resisted any attempt to use Diana's possessions as public symbols during moments of family conflict. To him, her memory had already been pulled into too many arguments, interviews, and accusations. He feared the jewel would become another weapon. Harry saw it differently. Historic pieces had been worn by other royal women without creating constitutional panic. Denying Meghan access, while allowing others to appear in jewels tied to the family's past, felt like a carefully disguised message. She could be invited. She could be tolerated. But she would never be trusted with the symbols that represented true belonging. Charles also feared what the appearance would do to the commemoration itself. The moment Meghan arrived wearing Diana's jewel, every other purpose of the event would disappear. Headlines would focus on rivalry, ownership, inheritance, and whether Meghan had claimed a place once held by another woman. Reconciliation would be buried beneath controversy. Palace advisors had already warned Charles that one exception could open the door to demands involving titles, security, royal residences, ceremonial rank, and even future inheritance. Meghan had expected this resistance. She had told Harry not to accept delays, vague promises, or symbolic gestures designed to keep them hopeful without giving them anything real. And nearby, she was waiting for the answer. Not an explanation. Not another review. A decision. Charles finally gave it. The jewel could not be included in any private agreement. To Charles, it was procedure. To Harry, it sounded like the first step toward rejecting everything they had asked for. Yet the jewel was only one part of Charles's refusal, and when he explained what else Harry would have to surrender before returning, the private meeting stopped sounding like reconciliation and began to feel like an ultimatum. Charles did not simply say no. He offered Harry a path back, but every step came with a price. Public restraint. Private obedience. No negotiations through the media. And one final condition so personal that Harry immediately understood Meghan would see it not as compromise, but as surrender. Charles told Harry that the door was not completely closed. He could attend the royal commemoration, but only as a member of the family, not as a central figure in the ceremony. There would be no restored public role, no special position, and no promise that his presence would carry the same weight it once had. It was an invitation, but one built inside strict limits. Meghan would also be welcomed as Harry's wife, Charles said. Yet, that welcome came without guarantees. She would not automatically stand beside senior working royals. She might be excluded from private family moments, restricted gatherings, or parts of the event considered too sensitive for anyone outside the active royal circle. To Harry, the message was unmistakable. They could return, but they could not return on equal terms. Then Charles separated the visit from every other dispute surrounding them. Security, titles, residences, ceremonial rank, and the status of their children would not be discussed as part of the arrangement. The commemoration could not be used as leverage in a larger negotiation. Harry would also be expected to make no public statement before or after the event unless the wording had been approved by palace communications. But the hardest condition was still to come. Before any return could be announced, Harry had to meet William privately. No Meghan. No advisors. No written demands. No recording devices. Just two brothers in one room, facing the bitterness that had been allowed to grow between them. Charles believed that conflict was the deepest wound in the family. He argued that no public reunion could survive while Harry and William remained divided beneath polite smiles and carefully arranged appearances. Until that anger was confronted, every ceremony would be theater. Harry rejected the condition almost immediately. Excluding Meghan, he said, repeated the same pattern that had damaged them before. The palace kept treating her as the cause of every disagreement, while refusing to admit how its own decisions had shaped the crisis. Charles answered firmly. Meghan was not being blamed, but the monarchy could not negotiate through a husband and wife acting as one political unit when the original fracture had formed between two sons. The tension hardened. Harry accused his father of offering access without dignity, visibility without equality, and family contact without trust. Charles refused to be moved. Reconciliation, he said, could not be bought through jewels, titles, photographs, or carefully staged symbols. That was when Harry understood the conditions had been prepared long before he entered the room. Advisors had already weighed the risks. The outcome had already taken shape. Charles gave his final answer. The private request, as presented, would not be approved. Harry left the room carrying a refusal he could barely explain, but the most dangerous moment was still waiting outside, because Meghan could read the answer on his face before he spoke a single word. Meghan did not need a written decision. She saw Harry return without the confidence he had carried into the meeting, and the silence between them told her everything. Charles had not merely rejected a request. In her mind, he had exposed exactly how the palace intended to control their return. Harry tried to soften the blow before giving her the full answer. He said the door was not completely closed. They could still attend the commemoration. There was still a path back, but it came with limits, private conditions, and rules neither of them had helped shape. His voice carried the strain of someone trying to turn rejection into possibility. Meghan did not hear possibility. She heard what had been denied. No guaranteed role, no jewel, no public recognition agreement for their children, no promise that she would stand beside the senior royals, and no right to take part in the private conversations that would decide everything affecting her future. She asked Harry whether Charles had ever truly considered the proposal, or whether he had simply allowed his son to speak before delivering a decision already approved by William and senior palace advisors. Harry hesitated. That pause mattered. He tried to explain that Charles had seemed conflicted. He said his father was balancing family emotion against royal duty. But Meghan saw that defense as another attempt to protect Charles from the consequences of his own choice. To her, the king had been given a private chance to act differently, and he had chosen the institution again. Her anger deepened when Harry revealed the demand for a private meeting with William. She was not simply being left outside one room. Decisions about her reputation, her marriage, her children, and her place in the family were being made in spaces where she was never permitted to answer for herself. That was where the divide between them became sharp. Harry saw limited access as a beginning. Meghan saw it as a trap. She argued that the palace could display Harry as proof of reconciliation while keeping her far enough away to carry the criticism alone. They would use his presence to show forgiveness, yet use her absence to suggest she had caused the division. Harry warned that rejecting every compromise could permanently damage his relationship with Charles. Time was passing. Age, uncertainty, and years of separation had made every future chance feel fragile. But Meghan reminded him how often private assurances had changed under pressure. Seating plans had shifted. Invitations had narrowed. Promises made quietly had been replaced by public messages that told a different story. Then, she returned to Diana. The jewel refusal, Meghan said, proved the palace still controlled not only history, but also who was allowed to inherit its emotional meaning. Harry could remember his mother, but he could not decide how that memory was shared. He asked Meghan to stay while he sought clarification. She refused to wait for officials to repackage the same answer in kinder words. Then she walked away, angry but controlled, leaving Harry with one final sentence. They did not refuse the request. They refused us. Her departure seemed private, but within the palace, doors had already opened, aides were exchanging urgent messages, and one question began moving through the royal household: had Meghan just ended the last serious chance of reconciliation? Royal households are built to contain emotion before it becomes news. But Meghan's departure created a problem no aide could easily control. She had left before the discussions were formally finished, and inside the palace, that single act was interpreted as anger, warning, and possible retaliation all at once. The first concern was not where Meghan had gone. It was what she might say once she was beyond the palace walls. Staff quickly realized she had left the private waiting area without receiving a formal briefing, without agreeing to another conversation, and without allowing officials to explain Charles's decision in softer language. The departure had happened too quickly for the usual machinery of control to catch up. Communications officials immediately understood the danger. If details emerged from Harry and Meghan's side first, Charles's refusal could be presented as another calculated rejection of his younger son's family. The palace would appear to have invited reconciliation only to impose conditions designed to humiliate them. Inside the household, opinions divided. Some advisors believed Meghan's exit proved the request had always been an ultimatum. They argued that she had expected Charles to surrender and had walked away the moment he refused. Others were less certain. They feared the palace had misunderstood the emotional stakes and reduced a deeply personal appeal to a question of rank, jewels, and protocol. William was informed that the meeting had collapsed. He learned about Harry's request involving Diana's jewel and Charles's demand that the brothers meet alone. The news placed him in an impossible position. He wanted to protect their mother's memory from becoming a tool in another public battle. Yet he also knew that a final break with Harry could follow them for the rest of their lives. Catherine quietly raised the question few others wanted to ask. If Meghan was excluded from every serious conversation, how could the family expect her to trust the outcome? The palace might call the separation necessary, but to Meghan it would always look like decisions were being made about her rather than with her. Camilla saw a different danger. Charles could be accused of choosing royal rules over his son, reopening old claims that the institution demanded loyalty while offering little warmth in return. Still, Charles refused to chase after Meghan or reverse his answer under pressure. To do so, he believed, would weaken his authority and prove that private threats could force the crown to abandon its own boundaries. Harry remained behind for a few painful minutes, torn between following his wife and protecting the narrow opening that still existed with his father. Around him, officials prepared two possible accounts, one describing the meeting as warm and constructive, the other denying that any formal proposal had ever been considered. Then, a junior aide noticed something disturbing. Knowledge of Diana's jewel had already spread beyond the tiny circle permitted to know about it. Harry finally left without an embrace, a handshake, or even a promise that another meeting would take place. The silence between father and son carried more danger than any shouted accusation. But as Harry and Meghan moved farther from the palace, the story did not remain behind them, because someone had already begun shaping a version of the meeting that would make one side appear wounded and the other dangerously unreasonable. By the next morning, whispers of a failed private meeting had reached people who were never supposed to know it happened. Yet the details were strangely selective. One version described a father offering peace. The other described a king demanding obedience. And both versions placed Meghan at the center. Royal correspondents began receiving careful briefings that avoided direct accusations while still shaping the story. Harry, they were told, had presented conditions the palace could not responsibly accept. The language was measured, but its purpose was clear. Charles had offered a reasonable path forward, and Harry had allowed private demands to stand in the way. At the same time, sources sympathetic to Harry and Meghan told a very different story. Charles had not offered reconciliation, they claimed. He had offered a controlled appearance, designed to protect the monarchy's image while leaving the couple's deeper concerns untouched. Harry could attend, Meghan could be present, and the palace could claim unity. But nothing meaningful would change. Neither side named the jewel at first. Instead, quiet references began circulating about Diana, inheritance, and symbolic royal property. Those words were vague enough to avoid confirmation, yet specific enough to direct suspicion toward Meghan. She immediately understood what was happening. In her view, the palace was building the same familiar picture. Meghan as angry, demanding, and obsessed with status, while Harry was presented as a wounded son who might return if separated from her influence. Harry was more disturbed by the accuracy of the reports. Some descriptions reflected phrases used inside the private meeting. Details about William, approved statements, and ceremonial conditions had escaped a room that was supposed to contain no witnesses. Confidentiality had not merely weakened. It had been broken. Charles ordered an internal review, but advisors warned him against pushing too hard. A visible investigation could frighten staff, trigger more disclosures, and make the palace appear desperate to hide what had happened. William refused to respond publicly. His silence, however, became another weapon. Palace loyalists treated it as quiet support for Charles. Those defending Harry and Meghan saw it as proof that William had helped shape the refusal from the beginning. Then a darker possibility emerged. The jewel Harry requested may have been discussed inside the royal household months earlier. If true, the palace had anticipated Meghan's interest before Harry ever raised it. Someone knew the request was coming. That raised an even more dangerous question. Had Harry been encouraged to ask for something that could never be approved? A demand guaranteed to fail could create the confrontation needed to close the door permanently while making him appear responsible. Meghan urged Harry to stop chasing private compromises. Unless they challenged the story, the palace would define their motives for them. Harry hesitated. Public retaliation could destroy what remained of his relationship with Charles. But silence could make the refusal look reasonable, and Meghan's departure unstable. Then a personal message arrived from Charles. There was no apology and no reversal, only a warning: once the private details became public, there might be no path back. Harry now faced the decision Charles had tried to avoid placing before him: protect the privacy of the father who refused him, or defend the wife who believed that silence had always been the palace's most powerful weapon. The refusal had begun as a private family decision, but it now threatened titles, loyalties, inheritance, and the future identity of the monarchy itself. Harry could still accept Charles's terms. Meghan could still return. Yet doing so would require one of them to surrender the very principle they believed protected them. Harry was trapped between two versions of the same future. Charles had left a narrow path open, but every condition attached to it seemed to demand obedience before trust. Meghan saw that path as a return to the very system they had escaped, a system that welcomed them only when they accepted silence, limits, and decisions made without them. She refused to apologize for walking away. Her anger, she insisted, had never been about losing access to a jewel. It came from realizing that her reputation, her children's place, and her future relationship with the monarchy were still being discussed in rooms she was not allowed to enter. To her, that exclusion was the real answer. Harry's pain ran deeper. He had approached Charles hoping to speak to a father, but Charles had responded as a king. The difference was devastating. Charles believed fatherhood could no longer be separated from duty, precedent, and the consequences of every royal concession. Harry believed that logic had already cost their family too much. Charles carried his own burden. His refusal may have protected the rules surrounding the royal collection, but it also risked destroying what remained of his bond with his younger son. He had defended the institution, yet he could not be certain the institution would comfort him if Harry never returned. At the center of everything remained Diana's jewel. To Harry, it represented emotional inheritance and a connection no palace official could erase. To Charles, it remained property under royal custody. To Meghan, it had become proof that belonging inside the monarchy was always conditional. The palace quietly removed the piece from consideration for every upcoming public appearance. No other royal woman would wear it while the dispute remained unresolved. Officials hoped this would prevent further anger, but the decision only revealed how explosive the object had become. Then, William sent word that he was prepared to meet Harry. But the conditions were firm. Harry had to come without demands, public threats, or negotiations involving Diana's memory. Catherine quietly suggested another approach. The brothers should begin with their children, the years they had lost, and the grief they still shared. Not titles. Not ceremonial rank. Not royal property. Meghan remained unconvinced. Emotional meetings, she feared, could delay real decisions while the palace continued shaping the public story. Harry drafted 2 replies to Charles. In one, he accepted the meeting with William. In the other, he warned that no return was possible unless Meghan entered every discussion as an equal participant. He sent neither. And so Meghan's departure began to look less like a final rupture, and more like the opening move in a larger struggle over Diana's legacy, the Sussex children's royal future, and Harry's place in the family. The palace had kept its rule. Meghan had kept her pride. Harry had kept neither peace nor certainty, and Charles's refusal now hung over every future invitation.